Hey there, I'm Dave from EZ Billiards. I'm going to go through changing the bearings on a quarter cable laminate trimmer. Some of the tools you're going to need in the way that I do it. I use a battery powered drill to take the screws out if I can, or a regular Phillips. You'll need a T9 Torx driver for the motor brushes. Without that, you're not going to get them out. Also use a nail set, or you can use any kind of punch that's about the same size. I also use a flat blade screwdriver, a Sharpie, and I have some of the tools that I just designed that really help with this. This one is a real important one. This is used for, number one, if you screw it to the board, you can use it as a way to hold the unit as you're starting to take it apart and put it back together. It also the main purpose is to hold the base and the bottom bearing steady as you press the armature back into the bearing on the bottom base. That's that one. This is a plate I designed for helping to remove the top bearing off the armature, using it with a vise and a hammer. This is a piece it goes into the drill chuck of a drill press to help you press the shaft back into the bottom base and not damage the tip of the armature. This is to push the top bearing onto the armature. Again, using a drill press works great. You can use a lathe, but I found some of the times the tailstock kind of moves on you because you're putting so much pressure. All depends on what you want to do. Fits into a 1/2 inch drill chuck. And this is what I use to press the bottom bearing into the bottom part of the housing. The bearing, I've got one here. Bearing fits right on it. It's slightly smaller, just slightly, so that it doesn't rub on the edges of the housing as you're putting this in. Puts the pressure right where it needs it though. Okay, that's the basic tools. I also have a piece of phenolic I use to push the bottom bearing out of the bottom base. You can use a socket if you have one that fits. It all depends. This here I machined it to just catch what little bit of the bearing is exposed on the outer raceway. So if I had to take this apart and put it back together, because the bearing turned out to be good, I can, it won't damage the bearing, hopefully. Well, that's about it. I guess we'll start. Again, screw that to the board. Now on this one here, I've done it before, and I removed the pin. It's a pain in the butt to take it out and put it back in. So what I do is I machine the tip down a little bit so it just slides right into the hole. Turn it, it drops into place. Now it's locked, and I don't have to push it. It's not going to be spring loaded. And you got the collet in there. So you take the nut off and then the collet out. That's what I use the flat blade for usually. You can use it to break it loose, just don't drop it. I also put all my parts into something so that I don't lose them or misplace them. Okay, now with this pin still in it, you got to take the spindle nut off. So what I do is, with that in there, I put that up against in a vise so it can't fall out, and just lightly clamp up on it. You don't want to go too hard because it can break the housing. And I just use a simple push pin, nail set. Kind of brace the body a little. I guess I don't have it in there as good as I thought. Third time's always a charm. Okay, we got that in there a little more secured now. What doesn't help is I'm pushing away from the jaws instead of into it. Okay, now I broke it loose off camera. And you just spin it off. Don't forget to take the pin back out. Okay, now that that's out, as you can see, the bearing is in there. Now it sits right in there while you disassemble the top. There's a Phillips head on the cover. What I usually do is try to keep the cord up. There we go. The cover comes off, switch comes out. Try to remember how the wires go. The white wire goes from behind this clip and towards the motor switch. If you do that, everything goes back together a lot smoother. Okay, T9 Torx driver. Come on up. Yeah. Sometimes these brushes start to pop out of the holder before you actually get them out. There's one. There's two. Now if you don't take the motor brushes out first, and you take these screws out and you try to pull it through, there's a good chance you're probably going to damage them, or at your very least you're not going to get the armature out. You'll get it to move a little bit and it's going to jam because the bottom bearing or the top bearing is going to hit them. So you got to take those out before you go to this step. And like I said, I like to use a little bit of mechanical power. Okay, and get your screws out. Okay, now that should come out. And sometimes it comes out with the rubber cup that the top bearing sets into. You got to remember to put that back, otherwise the whole top is going to kind of flop around when you go to run it. Just popped right back in. Okay, we're done with that side for now. The rest comes down to this. We've got the top bearing in there. Yeah. Okay. Okay. This slides right under. Now normally it would go right under the bearing, but in this case I've done this one already before, and when I did it I lost a fiber washer that was in there, so I had to put a steel washer in, a little bit larger diameter, so I can't fit this in right there, but normally that's where it would go. So I got to go below that, below the fiber washer, and hold that right in there. Now I do, as soon as I find the clamp I'll be much happier. Here we are. What I do is I put a board, I clamp that to it. And try to put something underneath there to catch it. This doesn't always get it, but main thing is not to lose any of the washers. That's very important. You don't want to lose those. Actually, yeah, why don't we wait on the top bearing? Kind of jumping ahead of myself. Okay, we'll take the shaft out of there. Now you want to adjust your vise to be open where it hits on the edges, not on this circular fitting. You know, if you knurl that over, it won't go back into the housing properly. It won't line up. And on that, I use a little bit thicker nail set, but still a nail set. And again, I put something there to catch it. And you go right in the center. And you try to catch it. And it pops right off. Usually doesn't take much to pop them out. I go with a little bit larger hammer so that I don't have to hit it as hard or as many times. The weight of the hammer does a lot of the work. Okay, now that we got that off, now we go for this. And this just slides right in there. Now you could also do this in a coffee can, or if you had one that was a little taller than this. That's the only thing. You need a little bit deeper so that you can get it to drop out, but I usually just use the vise. Now you want to do it so that you keep an eye. You want it to be almost about an 1/8 of an inch of space on either side of the armature, so that it gives good support, because this one's a little bit tougher to push out. Got a couple rags here. I like this to have a softer landing generally. Now there's a point right in the shaft from where it was turned. I use a nail set that fits right in there. And the reason I make sure that it fits in there is this way here there's no chance of it sliding off. If it doesn't sit in there and it slides off while you're hitting it, you can knurl the edge of the armature shaft, and then you gotta have to file it down, so on and so forth. You'll usually feel it starting to go. You just try to keep your hitting very controlled. And I got the fiber washer and the steel washer and the bearing off. Okay, so now everything's open. Usually if there's any dust on the blades, I clean it off. Clean this up. Don't sand this. If there's any kind of rust or anything, just use a little bit of denatured alcohol or maybe acetone to take anything off. If you put sandpaper to this, unless you're just trying to take off, like maybe there's a slight edge on these lock holes, if you just take sandpaper and start going like that, you change the diameter just enough to where now the new bearing won't fit on it. It'll end up being loose, and you don't want that. Okay, next step, removing the bottom bearing. Now this has got 4 Phillips head screws. They look normal, but they are put in with red Loctite normally. Now these have already broken loose before, so these should just come out, but sometimes they do not come out easy, and you got to kind of struggle with them. Sometimes they get a little too happy with the red Loctite at the factory. Okay, and that plate just pops off. Like I said, if you got dirt in there, now's a good time to clean it all up. Okay, so now you can see the bearing. You can see how much red Loctite they put in there. Nice of them. Alright, now do away with this now. Those 2 pieces go. Now, you still got to protect your edge here. So this gets a little tricky to do. You got to space your vise out enough, and putting something. In this case, I'm using some plastic, old pieces of cutting board. But it's soft enough. Try to line it up and line this up, whatever you're using to press it out with. And then you just keep turning. Sometimes they start hard, but they just pop right through. Just like that. And it's out. Now again, you want to clean up anything that might be kind of dirty. Inspect this, make sure there's no cracks in the aluminum. I've actually seen one that got cracked, but that's because I dropped it and didn't realize it had cracked. Change the bearings. Okay, next step. Putting a new bearing in. Now, what I do is I take a little bit of lubricant, just deep creep, or sometimes I use tranny fluid. Just put a little film on it. It helps it go together a little bit better. And you can kind of start the bearing a little bit. But okay. Now you can use drill press, or you can use the same thing. The vise. Here it's not as important to cushion this, and you can. And I've got more of that plastic around somewhere. Yeah. This here fits right into the bearing. So it's got a nice positive grip. The other thing is always make sure you're as close to the center of your vise as you're clamping up, so that most vices are going to be centered. If you're too close to the edge, it kind of cocks it, and it can cock your bearing as you're trying to put it in. You're just gently pushing it in, and you'll feel when it hits bottom. Nice and easy, nice and flush. You can also tell, if you look in here, you'll be able to see if there's any gap. If you have any question, always check that. So new bearings in. Put the plate back. Sometimes these screws don't go back right away because they got that red Loctite. Sometimes it's right at the opening and they don't seem to want to thread, so you kind of have to push a little. Well, actually, at this point in time, let me back up because of the way this one is set up, I missed a step that you guys will probably have to do. And that is the lock pin for when you change your bits. This is the pin. There'll be a spring on it, and there's a lip usually on this side, which I've machined off. You got to put the spring on, going in from this side. Compress the spring all the way. Try to get it hooked behind here as you start to push this in. And then it just goes in. The spring has to be, the spring will end up between here and the back of the pin. Sometimes it has a tendency to go through the hole as you're trying to put it in. You're going to have to kind of pull it back out, and got to make sure the spring rides on the outside of this housing here and up against the pin. Once you have that in there, then you can put the plate back in. When you take this apart, before you can take the bearing out, you take the plate off, you're going to have to remove the spring and the pin. It is a bit of a pain, so for me it's just easier not to have to worry about it. You know, if I got to, you know, when I'm changing a bit, I have a pin that I made that I just stick it in there and then undo what I got to do, and away I go. And it's all a matter of choice on that one. That was on one. Yeah, I use the clutch setting, usually on one. I kind of missed it on that one. Let me give a quick check, make sure they're tight enough. I have not had to re-Loctite any of these in the past. There's usually so much still in there that you can feel it as you put it in. The screws go in real firm. They're not going to vibrate out. So I haven't had any do that yet. So, now, the next step that I usually do is putting the bearing back in on the top. Now, can do it either way. Now, what I do, I gotta move the camera. Please don't mind my messy shop as you see around. This is pretty much the only spot that I've been using a drill press for. You open up your chuck. Like I said, this goes into a 1/2-inch chuck. Now this has got a ridge on it. You make sure it's pushed all the way up to the face of the chuck. What that does is stops it from moving as you're trying to press it down. Okay, make sure you use a piece of wood, a little soft. Yeah, nothing major, but I could even drill a small hole in there just to kind of hold it. That's up to you. I put it on. Now this also has a bevel, slightly. Let's see if I can show that to you. So one of the important things is there's an edge on this that is made to the diameter of this inner race. And what that does is so that when I'm pushing on it, it's not pushing on the outside, which won't hold the pressure. It can damage the bearings, especially if you're putting in ceramic bearings. Ceramic bearings, you really got to make sure you press them on right. So I made this to where it fits right on this center race. Very important. That's why I don't recommend using a lot of hammers and banging and using sockets, and because if you're slightly off, you can damage the bearing, and you won't know it till you put it all back together and you turn it on, and all of a sudden it makes some of the worst noises you ever thought you could hear. And it destroys the very expensive ceramic bearings. Okay, so as you're putting this down, you line it up on there. What I do is I make sure it's straight, and then push. Now right now this is loose. Let me zoom in on that a little bit. I can find the zoom handle. Okay. This washer is still a little wobbly. And that's how you can tell when you're down far enough is line that up. Okay, is you push down and it snugs up. Just a little bit, but that washer shouldn't move once you've got that bearing on there. Okay? It should not wobble side to side. And now it's put back right on. Nice and flush, just the exact way it should be. That's the only thing I use that piece for. So, well, actually, right. Okay, but I do use the drill press to put the shaft back in the base. Okay. I lied when I said this is about the only thing I use the drill press for in this setup. Okay, this is where the small one comes in. And again, you insert right up till that that ridge stops it from going any further. This is where this comes in handy. Is this ridge is made to the size of this race, which is where you want to really support so that the ball bearings don't get any side pressure. So it'll sit right on that. This here is machined to fit right inside here so it keeps it centered. And of course the hole allows for the shaft to go through. All together, that's what it does. Okay. And then you want to make sure you're only pushing on the shaft of the armature. And you just, that's it. She's all back in. No wiggle, no damage. Okay, let's put her back together. it's easier to do it this way. Okay. Now we're ready to put it back together. Slide it in. Now earlier I put a Sharpie mark here and here from previous times I've done this. And that helps you line everything up, that rubber cap, so that you get the housing back together correctly. You know, the right side on the right side of the housing. Again, I've got this set on a number one clutch. Okay. This comes in real handy for putting it together and taking it apart. Okay, next up are the brushes. Now in this case the holders came off, so got to put them back on. And I'm missing one of the screws. Oh, there it is. Okay, a little spring right here and a pin. Now that spring, when you put the brush facing towards the router, you're going to take that spring, catch it on the back of that brush, and spin this around and set it on the pin. And then now the brush is going to be spring loaded. Now what I find works good is at an angle going like this towards the router, put the brush against the armature and slide down, and this will sit right into the recess that's made for it, and the brush should be right up against the armature just nicely. And remember, this is a T9 Torx bit. Get one before you start because you won't get far without it. Okay, same thing on this side. There's a slot cut in the brass even that you can see, and that's where the spring goes right through there. And of course this side's a little trickier because of the weight of the cables. You hook it, swing it, set it in. Then just put your finger on top, get the white wire out of the way, push down at an angle against the armature and set it in. And screw it down. Okay, as I said earlier, paying attention to how the wires came out, the white one goes behind, comes from behind and goes through the clip. And the wire nut will end up on top of the motor basically. The switch sets into a little recess right above the Porter Cable logo. The wire's coming up out of it. And I usually just put the wire nuts a little to the side so that they're not up at the top. Usually there's just enough room to get them in there without hitting the brush housing. You'll know if get a brush wire hanging out. You'll know when you got it right because it pretty much only goes a certain way. Boom. You know, and once it's seated properly, you'll have a little, like an 1/8 inch rim, but you know, you can tell it is seated properly. And the switch is right where it belongs. take the screw, put the screw back in on top. Alright, now in my case I don't have the locking pin in it, so I just set it in, turn it till it falls in. If you have yours in there and it's spring loaded, what I do is I push it in, lock it, holding my finger on it, and then catch the edge of the vise and slide it in. And that holds it locked while you do this. In my case, I don't have to worry about it, too much. But then we put our spindle nut back in. What I usually do. Okay, now this will only tighten up so much. Okay, you don't slam it. Don't spend a lot of time cranking it. I kind of put my hand on it because I'm hitting away from the jaws of the chuck, so it's going to want to move. Just tapping it. You don't want it to fall out of the vise. Like that. Okay, well, now that, again, if you can put it this way with your locking button here, and now be hitting straight into the jaws, but you kind of have to push and hold as you tap. Yeah, in my case I don't have to, but you just want to give a couple sharp wraps to snug it in there. And put your collet and your nut back on, a little snug. Pop the pin out. And always make sure, because in the handling it's very easy to flip this switch, make sure your switch is off before you plug it in. I've had these jump across the bench before. And you do a test. Good as new. Well, I hope this was helpful to as many people that it can be. I'm not a paid actor, so there's a lot of uhs and umps and mistakes. But as I said, hopefully it explains quite a bit. It's not that hard to do. All in all, it's about a 20-minute procedure if you take your time. Once you've done it, the first time it's a little slower, but after you've done it a few times, you can pop them out pretty fast. One recommendation I would make is, with the amount of usage these get, I don't necessarily wait for them to die, the bearings to get bad where I'm noticing it. I just write down when I do them. And I don't write it on a router because they end up rubbing off. I tried that. But I have a book where I keep track of certain things. I write down when I did them last. And then about a year later, I kind of judge it. But about a year later, I just change them. The bearings are so inexpensive compared to letting it go too far, where the bottom bearing especially. I have seen one that a buddy of mine had that the bottom bearing seized up and it twisted and actually changed the diameter of the armature shaft to where he needed a new armature because it was too small by the time he got done. Once we got it out of it, it was too small because it spun. I don't think it's worth waiting till then. The bearings are cheap. You can do in the course of an hour or so, you can do 2 or 3 without a problem. And that includes even if they're really caked up with dirt, you can clean the housing, you can do a lot. So anyways, if you're interested in the tools, just give me a holler on AZ. They help out a lot, especially if you've got multiple units. This alone is a nice feature, just where it can stand up and work on it nice and easy. But that's your choice. Thank you for watching. Hope it was entertaining and educational. Thanks.